Oh, wow, that's an arty filter you got there, Tobias. It's just the sun.
Yeah,
It looked really cool.
I'm working on it.
Okay. Hang on. Let me just see if I can do this smoothly. Yes, brilliant. Okay. Well, 9:30, we got our speaker, we got our paper, we're ready to go. Exciting. Nice. So just to repeat the rules of Neuroccino, absolutely everyone is welcome to join us and present a paper they were excited about. The only condition is it's not supposed to be, what are you doing with the filters, guys? This is confusing. It's not supposed to be your own research. Today we have Cesare, who is presenting a paper still in the plant theme, I just saw. So we're following on from last week's Neuroccino that got everyone very excited. We were talking about it all week. And Cesare is currently with us in Bordeaux and on an Erasmus. So we're super excited. He is presenting a paper for us today. Just don't let them irritate you with all the animation that's currently going on here. Just ignore them. If you want to share your screen, I shared a paper over on YouTube as well with everyone watching over there, and then we're ready to go.
Yeah. I've chosen Sentience in Plants from Simona Ginsburg and Eva Jablonka of the Open University of Israel and the Cohen Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science, because last Neuroccino was very interesting for me. And actually, I really liked the discussion we had on consciousness and plants consciousness and plants neurobiology. But at the same time, I felt the need to dig a little deeper into it because I felt that we were missing definitions and framework to work on the plant's consciousness and in general consciousness. And you all know that way better than me, probably. But I wanted to dig deeper into it. And so here we are. First things first. The authors define sentience as consciousness as the ability for subjective experience. But they actually start with the definition of consciousness for the biopsychists, which are all those scientists, and botanists, and philosophers that think that plants have consciousness. And they actually think sentience is an inherent aspect of life. They say it's a primitive of nature. And by saying that, they are basically saying that this is an axiom. So, for example, Reber, which is actually known for implicit learning, he's a cognitive psychologist, say that sentience is a primitive of life and has emerged as the first living entities appeared on our planet at every level. And by assuming that, biopsychists say that only something like subjective experience can enable survival and reproduction through awareness, through the ability to make decisions, and so on. And although it's true that we can see adaptability in biological beings, as in cognitive terms, like learning, action selection, and so on, all the capacities that they are attributing to cells, for example, can actually be accounted for without using sentience. And that's already a first thing. The fact is that according to Reber, but in general, the biopsychists, using their axiom, accepting it, would allow to get rid of the difficulty of accounting for the emergence of consciousness. And at the same time, they say it acknowledges better, basically, the evolutionary continuity between all living beings, and it makes sense of biological phenomena like the fact that plants react to anesthesia, and they actually pushes them a bit too much, probably, by saying that it would allow for identification of sentience genes. We all know that genetics doesn't work like that. We don't have specific genes for specific, not for sure for sentience. But what about the other points? Well, the first point about getting rid of difficulty of explaining the emergence of consciousness actually raises another point, which is how are the single conscientiousnesses of single cells, for example, make up for the overall consciousness of a macroscopic being? And what about conscious and non-conscious states? Also, biopsychists say that their view makes more sense because it acknowledges the evolutionary continuity between living beings. But the transition-oriented approach the authors support actually doesn't exclude it, because we know that we have some homology among different species, different phyla, but this doesn't mean that there can be major transitions in evolution, which are actually effects in evolutionary biology. Finally, what about anesthesia and so on? Well, the fact that plants produce anesthetics as chemical compounds doesn't mean they are using it for that purpose. And at the same time, it's not surprising that chemicals react with a biological being like plants. So that's kind of flawed. Yeah, so with everything in mind, even with these counter arguments, we can't really exclude the possibility that plants have sentience, and that sentience is an emerging property of complex biological organization, such a plant. But we need criteria for that. We need some way to define what's conscious and what's not. And actually, Ginsburg and Jablonka developed an evolutionary approach to the study of sentience, which revolves around the concept of evolutionary transition marker. The evolutionary transition marker is a system capacity that requires some properties to exist, basically. They make the example of origin of life research. With it, they say we don't have a clear definition of life, but we have a list of properties that an organism should have to be considered alive, basically. And they are like, for example, death, reproduction, growth. We basically all know them from high school, probably. These properties are required for the existence of the evolutionary marker of life, that is unlimited heredity. So from this point of view, from this perspective, the authors wanted to find the evolutionary transition marker for sentience. And they looked at consciousness research to find those properties that were individuated as necessary and sufficient for a system to be sentient. They looked, and this is a joke back, they looked at biological, psychological, cognitive, philosophical studies that were mainly done in human research. And so, yeah, we are starting from humans to go to plants. That's kind of joke, but anyway. They found these capacities, for example, temporal depth, selective attention, open-ended adaptability, and many others. And these capacities are required to have the evolutionary transition marker for sentience that they called unlimited associative learning. The UAL refers to the organism's ability to, for example, discriminate between patterns of sensory stimuli, or composite action patterns, or also to use previously learned stimuli and actions as basis for future learning, and a couple others. And they have screened basically all the domains of nature of living beings, and they have found that most vertebrates, some arthropods, and few mollusks exhibit UAL, while plants don't really. They say there is arguably, because it's at the time of the paper was published in 2021, so last year, these experiments were not really replicated yet, but they say that these experiments said that there is limited associative learning in plants, but still it's not comprehensive associative learning. So no UAL in plants, and therefore, in this perspective, no consciousness. Yeah, anyway, the biopsychists argue that there are structural and functional analogies between plants and animals and humans. And these analogies should account for consciousness in plants, basically. The fact is that this is kind of wrong, because the differences are many and kind of big. For example, plants do have action potentials, but they are in the range of seconds, so very slow. And they have a vascular system that has been associated with the nervous system of animals and humans, but it is not as much as complex as ours, for example. And there is no evidence for things like perceptual mapping or memory or flexible integration of percepts and so on. So these are all aspects that do not account for the UAL in plants. Authors are not doubting the agency of all organisms, basically bacteria. This agency exists to account for survival and reproduction, but not necessarily for consciousness. Using consciousness to explain them is a bit too much. It's taking it too farther. And that's why subjective experiencing the world is not really appropriate when talking about plants. Plant neurobiology is interesting and have some potentials, could lead to a really interesting insights and findings, but the very notion of it, as it is considered nowadays, is kind of flawed. And I'd like to conclude as Danny Chamovitz, who says that plants do not have neurons, just as humans don't have flowers. And that's kind of the point here. Yeah, that's it for sentience in plants. Apparently, we don't have it. They don't have it.
Thank you very much. I like that conclusion. Right, questions? Especially in comparison to last week's paper on plants and cognition. Any questions? Leah?
Hi, thank you, Cesare. I saw that this is a really recent paper, so I was thinking, so we widely discuss, I see that it's all the points are widely discussed, so which could be the next step? So what do you think can be like something to investigate even further in this debate?
Well, I don't know if the UEL is the correct approach for the study of consciousness, but I like the idea behind it, basically, because consciousness is difficult to grasp, and this is a quite systematic way to study it, I think. And so maybe further approaches and studies could be just investigating this framework and see if it is consistent maybe.
Okay, some measures. Yeah. Thanks.
So basically, the conclusion from last week was more or less plants do have maybe a kind of consciousness, whereas the conclusion today is more like, no, they don't. Am I getting this right, the vibe?
Yeah, it seems so. Yeah, at least from this perspective.
Okay. Victor, I think you were first.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Cesare. It's more comments than a question. I mean, we are here to discuss. So anyway, it's about the definition of consciousness that is so cloudy to me, because as human beings, we tend to define consciousness as this thing that we perceive. Actually, it's a complete, it's almost like an emotion or something. It's something that we feel and that we know exists because we can feel it. And so we can share this feeling, well, share the fact that all humans awake are supposed to feel this at least approximately the same way. And so we start from that. But then how can you apply that to any other being, even if this kind of thing is there in other beings? It's like, it's really hard. It's as long as we don't exactly know what it is, at least in humans, we can't really we can't really have a proper way to translate it to other beings, even those that are close to us. Because saying consciousness, oh yeah, when you're awake, you are conscious, and where you're sleeping, you're unconscious. Yeah, seems about right. But then there is so many more things that are different between being awake and not. And you've got tons of animals that are that have also the wake and sleep cycles, but they are so much simpler that it begs the question if they have the same kind of consciousness that we have. I'm telling, of course, at a different necessary level, but if you we think about like the way we perceive other beings having consciousness is usually, or having a sort of consciousness, is usually by comparing ours, like a dog behaving almost like a human on something with eyes. Obviously, he has some level of consciousness, but that is a very limiting factor to take into account when you want to define what is consciousness. So for me, we are way too early to be able to define what is consciousness, at least the way we perceive it. And so if we want to study this kind of thing, we need to find another term, because being aware of one's environment and reacting to it and communicating it and stuff like that, it's something a bit different. And being aware of ourselves and feeling this awareness is difficult, I think, to test and to see in other animals. There are tests, but because we can't really experience them from the animal perspective or the plant perspective, it's, I don't know, it's hard to grasp. So yeah, I don't know if it's a problem that we can actually solve, at least now.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you, actually. And I think that basically what we can take home from this paper is just that we don't take home really anything, basically, because it's just that we can't really say if plants in this case are sentient or not. But there is no reason for it till now. And as science teaches us, we can accept it till this hypothesis will be falsified. And that's it. We can accept our limits for now and wait for future technologies, maybe, or discoveries to open the path, I think.
That's also something that we arrived at last week to discuss how we measure consciousness, how we define it, and what we mean by it. And to me, like the paper you presented today is quite interesting, because in the first sentence of the abstract, I think they talk about the merging of biology and philosophy, but there's no psychology in there in terms of consciousness. Ma has a question for you.
Yeah, well, actually, it was more like a comment too. Just to say that thank you for presenting like the other part of this debate. I find this very interesting when there is a debate in the literature, and especially philosophers are quite nice when they argue and they debate between them. In consciousness, as philosophers are very important in the topic, there are many debates like this, like for example, the front or the back of the brain. And it's true that when you read the paper, like saying that consciousness is in the front of the brain, you at the end, you are convinced that is true. And when you read the other paper of the back of the brain is the important part, you say, okay, yeah, I also buy this. So for me, it's mostly the same with this. Like I read the paper of the last week, and I'm quite convinced. And then they also have some good arguments. So for me, this is meaning that we already don't know. We cannot, I don't think we don't have enough information to put yourself like in this part of the spectrum or in the opposite one. So maybe we are in the middle. So there is no black or white, is something more in the middle, because yeah, all more or less all arguments make sense. And yeah, and regarding the definition of consciousness that you were saying, it's true that it's difficult to define, but because consciousness, I guess, is like an umbrella. And under this umbrella, there are many things. So if you want to have like a more specific definition, then you are just looking at a piece of what is consciousness. So defining consciousness, like the whole perspective, is very hard. So it's they usually define some type of consciousness, if you want a more specific definition, because it's very big. It's like executive function. You cannot define executive function in an only way. There are many executive functions. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, with what you said, Stephanie and Victor said, I think that what's helpful with this paper is that, as you said, consciousness is an umbrella concept. And they addressed consciousness as subjective experience, and they counter-argued people saying that plants have subjective experience, so not other types, other shades of consciousness. And I think if we can accept the arguments of this paper, we can delete at least one aspect of one aspect of consciousness from the idea of sentience in plants. And that's already something.
I wouldn't delete it by now, but okay.
No, not in general, but just this aspect.
Maybe we can agree that we can narrow it down rather than delete it. Great. I don't see any other questions in the room for today or online. So thank you very much. I love the idea of having, it's actually the first time we did it, if I'm not mistaken, that someone presents a paper and then the next one builds on that paper and shows the different side of the argument, which I very much enjoyed. So thank you so much for that. That's something we should probably try to keep going whenever there is a debate, to really show both sides of the argument in a bit more detail. So wonderful, wonderful presentation on plant science again. Now with that, I'm going to release you into your weeks. Have an exciting week in science, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week, Monday morning again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.